Well, hello, I'm Tony Krautman. I am the chair of the economics department. And welcome to the second health economics speakers series sponsored by the DePaul University, the Driehaus College of Business, and the Department of Economics. This speaker series is a part of the economic department's new health economics initiative. Professor Anthony Lasasso, one of today's panelists, has been instrumental in developing and delivering this endeavor. And this initiative is part of a larger healthcare focus of DePaul University. Today's topic, the future of US healthcare, the implications of the election. Clearly, the recent election has important short run and long run consequences for this $3.6 trillion industry. The moderator of today's panel is Stephanie Goldberg, the Crain's Chicago Business of Crain's Chicago Business, the weekly business magazine, newspaper of Chicago. Stephanie Goldberg has joined Crain's in 2018 as a healthcare reporter. Prior to that, she spent time at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, as well as the Business Insurance magazine in Chicago. Stephanie, I'll take it, give it over to you.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the future of the national healthcare market. Each of our panelists are going to start by giving you an overview of what the outcome of the 2020 presidential election means for their segment of the industry, and then we'll follow up with a moderated discussion. So please submit questions at any time during the presentation using the chat or Q&A function, and we'll get to those later on in the program. I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Tony Lasasso, who is a professor and Driehaus Fellow at DePaul. As an economist, Tony has published widely on health insurance markets and benefit design, hospital finance, and more. Jennifer Bryant serves as Executive Vice President of Policy and Research for Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. At the trade group, Jennifer leads the development of legislative and regulatory strategies that support biopharmaceutical research companies. Liz Goodman is Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and Innovation at America's Health Insurance Plans. In her role, Liz helps members shape public policy strategies to improve health, affordability, and financial security. And last but not least, Aaron Wesolowski is Vice President for Policy Research and Analytics and Strategy at the American Hospital Association. He previously held positions at NORC at the University of Chicago and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And with that, I will turn things over to Tony.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And I do want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists. I really do appreciate all of your involvement with this. And I am going to share my screen because let's see. All right. So yes, the election issue, I guess the issue around healthcare, the healthcare industry and what it's facing in the wake of the election is what we're talking about here today. So I thought I would just sort of set the table a little bit for before we get to the people who are truly knowledgeable about the industry. So to start with here, I have to start with some assumptions because I'm an economist, and assumptions are I guess what I do for a living. Economists, of course, are never very good at, well, they're not very good at predicting the past, let alone the future. So I'm going to make a few what I think are going to be safe assumptions. And the first one is that Joe Biden has won the election. So sorry about trigger warning there, but I think that has happened. The second one is that the Senate's going to hold a bare majority. That's predicting the future there. So take that with some grain of salt, I suppose. There will continue to be Democratic leadership for the House, although a narrowed margin. And lastly, we probably will get into COVID, but I'm just going to assume in terms of how we talk about the issues here today that the pandemic is going to be solved in 2021. It will leave a mark though, and we'll probably touch on some of those issues going forward. So I'm going to talk about each of the broad industries that are represented on our panel today, and I'm going to speak in, well, broad terms about them. So I'm going to start with a few notes about the pharmaceutical industry. So it's only about 10% of total healthcare spending. And that's not a typo. That might surprise some of our attendees because it probably gets about 90% of the attention. And a lot of it has, at least until very recently, not been all that positive. But I think what we are seeing is that the innovation on display now in terms of the battle against COVID-19, I think really should give folks who like to bash the industry some pause. And I think what's emerging daily, in fact this morning, in terms of how positive the results are looking for some of the vaccines is really remarkable. From the standpoint not of just this year, but from the sweep of human history. And I pulled this off the web, this chart here, and basically what we can see is that it generally takes a long time to cure infectious diseases. But what we're seeing now, what we're living through right now, is truly historic and remarkable in terms of the ability to maybe have a cure here in very short order. So I think my takeaway is that everybody should know that innovation, like everything else, responds to incentives. And so that's my bottom line point. In terms of where I see sort of the pressure points for the pharmaceutical industry, I think the main one is pricing. Not necessarily regarding vaccines. I don't think anybody's in the US is going to pay a dime for their vaccine, whole other issue, but pricing. And so, very briefly, we know that patent protection is a trade that we make as a society to provide an incentive for innovation. And the cost of that is a temporary monopoly and the high prices that result. Now, that might be a reasonable trade. That might be entirely fair. But unfortunately, Medicare policy kind of injects a very unsavory element into this because Medicare has to pay for all FDA-approved drugs, whatever the price. And so the drug companies are able to simply decide upon a price. And this, strictly speaking, without having to go and draw a diagram, this is not the monopoly pricing model from the economics textbook. So I'll come back to this point in a bit, but I really want to make sure that people understand that most people get this point backwards here. And it's that it's not that drug prices are high because the investment in new drug discovery is so costly. That's the sunk cost fallacy. That's not why prices are high. It is the fact that the investment in new drug discovery is high because of high drug price. The reward is there, so the investment comes. And I'm not gonna take a stand on whether that's good or bad. I'm just simply going to state it as a fact. That's the key factor here. So, and again, I would refer back to my point that I just made on the previous slide that investment responds to incentives and outcomes also that result from that investment, positive outcomes, health improving outcomes. So in terms of, again, thinking about what the policy responses might be, I think it's unlikely, but not impossible that there might be some kind of bipartisan drug price control measure, some sort of grand bargain. I will just note parenthetically that most of the ideas being thrown around these days are pretty awful. I think more likely is that there'll be continued efforts to inject some type of cost effectiveness analysis, which incidentally, there's a key role for economists in those methods, but that will be injected into pricing decisions. And so I'll note the Institute for Clinical Economic Review, ICER. That's something that we all may be hearing more about. The drug companies, though, are very well aware of it. A couple notes now, turning the page to the private health insurance industry. So this, of course, is the industry that we all love to hate. However, I think insurance is one of the greatest inventions of humankind. And I personally place it right behind the invention of fire and the wheel. So it's high up there in importance in terms of what we've learned and the benefits for society. So just a few facts. Private health insurance industry covers about 220 million people, 180 million of which are through employment. One interesting note that not everybody knows is that most people with employer-sponsored health insurance coverage, around 3/4 of them, the insurance company is actually just serving an administrative capacity and not bearing the risk. So you traditionally think about insurance as risk bearing and spreading and all of that, but it's actually most people who work for large self-insured companies, they're actually doing the insurance function in terms of the risk spreading. So bottom line there is, complain to your boss if you're getting hassled and something's not covered, because it's probably their decision, at least implicitly. So, however, these numbers do ignore Medicare. 36% of Medicare enrollees are in privately managed Medicare Advantage plans, and it ignores Medicaid. 40 states, fully 40 states, are using managed care in their Medicaid programs, and roughly 70% of Medicaid enrollees receive their care through private insurers. So private insurance is a growing business and expanding on multiple margins. So the industry, however, is still facing a number of pressure points, and these are just a few that I identified. I think there is the slight chance of its complete elimination. So there's always an existential threat, and that's been thrown around these last few years. I don't think this is very likely, but it's out there. I think it might seem more mundane, but I think it's very important that the industry continue to innovate in the product space in terms of health insurance itself. I think there are potential antitrust concerns as the industry consolidates. Hasn't been a lot of consolidation, at least horizontally, big mergers between, but it's still happening. And these days, in fact, there's been a lot of vertical integration that we're seeing. So there are some potential antitrust questions there that it will be interesting to see how the new administration tackles that. And kind of relatedly, I think insurance is basically one of the most heavily regulated industries in the country. So navigating those regulations is a big deal. And then I think a point that I'm going to get to in a few moments is the industry combating the increased consolidation on the provider side, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So just a few notes on the provider side. Everybody does love their doctor for the most part. And now, of course, they're heroes, and we love them even more. So just a couple of facts here that might surprise some of you in terms of where the U.S. sits in terms of hospital beds per capita. The U.S. is kind of in the bottom half of OECD countries. It's over here, the red bar there. You can't really read what the other countries are. Japan is really high in terms of hospital beds per capita. I'm not entirely sure why that is, as is Korea, and the United States is down there. Similarly for physicians, United States against OECD countries, kind of in the lower half. And so if you thought that we had a very stocked supply of physicians and hospitals, at least from an international sense, well, we don't. But so now just a few more moments here to talk about some pressure points on healthcare providers. Industry consolidation, I think, is a big deal. The argument for consolidation is always that providers will realize efficiencies and be able to invest in quality improvements. Many economists argue that the real reason is pricing power and higher prices that they can charge. And the big question going forward is what sort of stance will the Biden administration's Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission take in terms of provider concentration and consolidation. Vertical integration is a big trend in the industries. We see hospital systems buying up provider practices, physician practices. Again, how will that trend be viewed by antitrust authorities? The final point here is, of course, why did Willie Sutton, famous bank robber, why did he rob banks? Because that's where the money is. And hospital care is a third of all healthcare spending, over $1 trillion. Physician care is 20%, that's about 700 billion. And ultimately, that's where policymakers are going to look when they want to do something about healthcare spending. So I'm going to stop now, and I am going to throw it over to Jennifer Bryant. So Jenny, the floor is yours.
I'm going to try to keep it really short because I think that it'd be more interesting to get into conversation than to hear me filibuster too much. But I'll start off with the question that I always get, what's going to happen? And I'll assure you, I do not have a crystal ball. It really broke permanently a few years back. And I still find that every week I wake up and discover that the world is different than I thought it was going to be on a Friday. So I'd say this week, I didn't anticipate that we would be seeing a rash of final rules from the Trump administration, which looks like they're going to be active until the, well into January. And yet that does seem like what's going to happen. So before I can even talk about what's going to happen next year, a key question is what's going to happen in the next few months. And it looks like tomorrow we're going to see two major rules out of the Trump administration. One that will affect medicines in Part B, the physician administered medicines, including oncology. That rule will attach prices from a basket of OECD countries to those Part B medicines. Interestingly, we haven't seen any real information about what's in the rule because they've kind of leapfrogged the regulatory process here. So there have been some earlier rules that moved in this direction of having some tie between Medicare prices and international prices, but unclear exactly what direction they have gone here. So that's one big rule. We'll see that tomorrow. And then the second is a major change in the way that drugs are paid for and has to do with changing the rules around discounts and rebates. So without going into all the gory detail, I'd say that's been a controversial proposal from the beginning. It absolutely will reduce costs for patients who pay a lot in cost sharing now by requiring that they get the benefit of discounts that are negotiated in the marketplace, but it will also have a lot of other sequelae and lead to a hot debate. So stay tuned for a really ferocious set of back and forth on drug pricing in the next couple of weeks. Just looking ahead to next year, I think if the prediction is right, the assumption is right that the Senate will stay Republican, which I think is a good assumption, but who knows? In that circumstance, divided government tends to be tends to make it harder to pass legislation, right? So I think that in that circumstance, you're more likely to see administrative action, and you're unlikely to see a large reform package for drug pricing or for like a real rework of the Affordable Care Act along the lines of Part D or, you know, a major new entitlement program. And I think it makes it harder to do things like a public option that the Biden team talked about during the campaign. But we'll have to see. A lot of the uncertainty also rests on what happens with COVID. What's the trajectory of the pandemic? How quickly can we get people vaccinated, and will the economy recover? And I think correctly, that will be the first focus of the next administration. And there's a lot of work to do there. You know, from an industry perspective, I'd say the issues that we care about and that we focus on don't really change with elections. We've been focused for a long time on the need to make the current market work better for patients. We believe that there are trends that we should be really concerned about in the way that insurance covers drugs. That, you know, we pile way too much cost sharing on really essential medicines that are crucial to treating chronic conditions. And it's unclear from a societal perspective, as well as from a personal perspective, that we get a lot of benefit from doing that. If patients can't afford their diabetes medicines, that leads to all sorts of future complications and is counterproductive. And from a pure fairness perspective, piling a lot of cost sharing onto oncology patients seems also counterproductive. Cost sharing makes sense if we're talking about trying to create incentives for patients to use lower cost, equally effective medicines. But we're not really expecting cancer patients to go out and like do a lot of research and second guess their physician on which treatment regimen they should be having. So it's really, in that circumstance, just a way of offloading costs onto the sickest patients so that we can keep premiums down for the healthy patients. And I would argue that is not what insurance is supposed to be about. So insurance is, I think, critically important, maybe as important as the wheel and fire, but it actually needs to work the way that insurance is supposed to work. And right now, I argue that it doesn't. Maybe I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say about what isn't and is not working in the prescription drug market. But I think the theme that I would stress is that in a world of divided government and with a change in administration comes an opportunity to step back and think about ways to find common ground and bipartisan solutions. And we've seen a lot of really very draconian solutions that are just very, very blunt tools that I think run the risk of wrecking the system that we have. And the last couple of years have been marked by really bad proposals and not owned by any one party. Bad Democratic proposals, bad Republican proposals. And it's an opportunity now for us to step back and sort of say, is there a way to find bipartisan common sense solutions that will be incremental, stepwise progress to get us a market that works better for patients and that generates more healthy competition, but doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and decide that we, are so anxious to just reduce prices that we're going to throw out incentives for developing the next generation of medicines. And I think with a lot of the proposals we've seen go so far and would cut so deeply that they really do risk crucial innovation. And we take a lot of that innovation for granted. The final thing I'd just say is the reason we're able to develop a vaccine within 12 months, which is an astounding accomplishment from the time that the genome was first mapped of the virus to now, inside 12 months, a vaccine start to finish, that is based on development using platforms and using sort of the clinical expertise and the know-how that's been sort of really produced over the last several decades. So that accomplishment sits on the shoulders of a system that we have in the United States that really it's created a thriving bioscience ecosystem. It just seems very counterintuitive to right at this moment when we're seeing the benefits of that system and reaping the rewards of having that type of system, to think about making changes that put all of that at risk so that we be not in the same situation if we have another pandemic in the future. And sadly, I think we live in a world where we will see future pandemics and we will continue to need innovation. And we should not take it for granted, but make sure that we are building a sustainable system that will continue to throw off new cures and innovations that can help drive down costs. So that was a mouthful. I'm going to stop, throw it back to you.
That's great. I think Liz Goodman is next. So you can go, Liz.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you to both Tonys and the Department of Economics for including me this evening. I apologize that I'm participating even more virtually than my colleagues. While I'm recovering from a small surgery, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to speak with you this evening. First, I just want to take a minute to introduce AHIP. AHIP is the national association whose members provide coverage and health for healthcare and health-related services to millions of Americans every day. Through these offerings, we improve and protect the health and financial security of consumers, families, businesses, communities in the nation, and we're committed to market-based solutions and public-private partnerships that improve affordability, value, access, and well-being for consumers. You know, Tony talked a little bit about the election. My plan was to sort of talk about what we saw and in our mind, why we think we saw it. As we head toward the Electoral College, finalizing the results of the presidential election and 2 January Georgia runoffs, it's important, I think, to consider some of the lessons of the 2020 election. And in my view, they're the following. First, voters want competent centrist leadership. So despite a divisive 4-year term, impeachment, and an array of other controversies, this election was largely a plebiscite on President Trump's disruptive leadership style and his administration's handling of COVID. Second, voters were engaged in a way that has not been seen in more than a century. The last time voter turnout exceeded this year's 66.4% was 1900, when 73.7% of eligible voters participated. But despite the historic level of participation, our electorate remains deeply divided. 77 million people roughly selected Mr. Biden and 71 million selected Mr. Trump. Third, the 2020 election broke all spending records. This year, a total of $13.9 billion was spent on the presidential and congressional elections. That compares to $6.5 billion in 2016. And Democrats far outraised Republicans 64.6% to 35.4%. However, despite all that money, President-elect Biden won narrowly, the Democratic majority in the House shrank substantially, and the Democrats so far have added 1 US senator. Fourth, despite widespread expectations of a blue wave, no wave materialized. In fact, the Senate will end up somewhere between a 50-50 tie and a 52-48 Republican majority, and House Democrats who went into election night with a 35-seat majority will, based on the current vote leads, see that majority shrink to somewhere between 9 and 11 seats, I think reflecting voter concern with some of the party's most progressive positions and members. Finally, even with Georgia's runoff elections still yet to occur in January, the 2022 election has already begun to loom large over the 117th Congress, which hasn't yet been convened. Both parties will face huge internal battles over their future direction and leadership. So with all that, what can we expect from Congress? From a healthcare standpoint, as Congress reconvenes in the post-election lame duck session, and with temporary government funding set to expire on December 11th, we expect they'll focus on 2 things: coronavirus and the budget. Congress will be working on appropriations for the fiscal year of 2021, either full year funding or more likely a short-term continuing resolution, as well as extenders relevant to this discussion related to Medicare and Medicaid, community health centers, and various quality programs administered by CMS. While another sweeping COVID-19 relief package is unlikely to be passed during lame duck, individual provisions could be addressed, such as unemployment insurance benefits and funding for COVID testing and treatment. AHIP has, since the beginning of the pandemic, been advocating for the inclusion of key priorities related to COVID, including funding for testing and treatment, federal support to make sure that people don't lose coverage during a public health emergency, including support for COBRA subsidies, and the continued inclusion of employee benefits as eligible payments under the PPP program, increasing the federal Medicaid assistance percentage, or FMAP percentage, for states, and additional flexibilities for Medicare Advantage plans to meet the needs of their members at this unprecedented time. So, as we have from the beginning of the COVID emergency, we'll continue to fight for those priorities, as well as for additional support for the provider partners that have been leading the charge in the response to COVID. As we head into the first 100 days of the Biden presidency, in addition to the usual procedural aspects of any new administration, particularly confirmation of the president-elect's cabinet appointments, we expect the initial focus will almost exclusively be on COVID-19, as Jenny said. The Biden COVID-19 plan includes doubling the number of drive-through testing sites, investing in home tests and instant tests, $25 billion for vaccine manufacturing and distribution, assuring that every American gets the vaccine free of charge, or a vaccine free of charge, establishing a COVID-19 racial and ethnic disparities task force, and creating a renewable fund for state and local governments to prevent budget shortfalls, and to assure a sufficient supply of PPE and other necessary equipment. AHIP and its member plans support all of these initiatives. In addition, as positions are fully staffed, we also expect the Biden administration will reverse an array of Trump administration regulations and executive actions. With respect to healthcare, we expect them to reduce changes made to the anti-discrimination rules put in place by the Obama administration under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, to repeal the public charge rule changes which negatively impact the ability of resident aliens to seek government services, including coverage under Medicaid and CHIP, and to reverse a series of Medicaid-related policies, including Medicaid work requirements and the Healthy Adult Opportunity, which is the name that the administration has given to essentially Medicaid block grants. Beyond COVID and the administration's regulatory agenda, how much of, and exactly as Jenny said, how much of Mr. Biden's plans can and actually will be accomplished is yet to be seen. The president-elect has been clear that he intends to be a unifier in chief, so we hope that he and his team will leverage his many years of deal-making experience in the Senate and as vice president to deliver on his promise to build on the ACA and to improve equity throughout American society, including health equity. That said, 34 seats will be up in the Senate in 2022, 22 GOP and 12 Democrat. And the wings of both parties oppose any deals with the enemy. So that will create a challenging environment in which to operate. I'm sure it will come as no surprise to this audience that AHIP and the other organizations represented by my colleagues on this panel have long opposed a Medicare-like government-run public option, which is among the Biden administration's significant policy goals. Simply put, we at AHIP believe that people benefit from private sector-driven choice and competition. An unproven government-controlled health insurance system will threaten Americans' choice of coverage and care by cutting payments to providers and hospitals. This will exacerbate existing challenges in accessing care, eliminate efforts to enhance and improve quality, and drive many healthcare providers and facilities out of business. A public option would negatively impact the stability of our insurance markets, and as a consequence, would negatively impact the health and financial security of the more than 200 million Americans served by AHIP's member plans. For all of these reasons, we believe that instead of a government-run public option, the administration and stakeholders should focus on where we agree, building on and improving what works. One clear action forcing event could be a negative result from the Supreme Court in the California v. Texas case heard last Tuesday. As I said, we believe that Americans should be able to choose from many healthcare options, and every American should have the support they need to get well when they're sick and to stay healthy when they're well. That's why we support building on the ACA and the protections it provides. We're encouraged by the thoughtful questions that were raised by the justices in those arguments, and we're confident that the court will come to the right decision to uphold the law and sustain the ACA's important consumer protections. Invalidating the law would be misguided and wrong and unleash chaos on the entire healthcare system. With that, I'll hand it off to my colleagues, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. I think I'm up next. This is Aaron Zlowski. I'm Vice President for Policy Research and Analytics at the American Hospital Association. The AHA is a sort of an umbrella organization. We represent all types of hospitals, for-profit, not-for-profit, public, across the country, rural, urban, safety net, teaching, non-teaching. We have about 4,000 members. So we represent a variety of interests and stakeholders. I'll end up echoing some of what the other panelists have said. But the first thing I just want to note is that, you know, it's impossible to talk about the road ahead without, you know, first acknowledging the impact of the pandemic, and the others have talked a bit about that. As it's persisted and surged, you know, throughout the country, the impact on hospitals and health systems has been truly profound. And obviously, as folks are aware, the country is experiencing a surge right now. Case rates and test positivity rates are up. Hospitalizations are up. As of yesterday, there were almost 80,000 inpatient hospital beds occupied by COVID-19 patients in the US, which is about 10% of all inpatient hospital beds. Overall, the inpatient occupancy rate is about 72%, which is incredibly high. Nearly 60% of all ICU beds in the US are currently occupied. In fact, the Mayo Clinic reported that on a recent day, every bed in their facility was occupied. And needless to say, that is highly unusual and not sustainable. As in previous waves, the current surges are affecting states differently. Most states are experiencing an increase in the number of new cases and positivity of tests right now, but the magnitude varies. And folks have seen some of the media reports about states in the Midwest and the West right now. So that's all to state the obvious, that the US healthcare system is under tremendous pressure right now, and hospitals and their employees are very much on the front lines. Staff burnout is incredibly high. And while hospitals can add beds, it's much harder to bring in additional healthcare workers, many of whom are justifiably experiencing a significant emotional and physical toll due to the impact of the pandemic. Large portions of hospital staffs may be under quarantine at any given time. 3 health systems in Cleveland recently announced that collectively they have over 1,000 staff under quarantine because they've tested positive or are waiting until they can return to work after having had COVID. In the event that beds or caregivers are limited, hospitals have systems in place to work with each other, with state and local public health departments and federal partners to find extra support, but that system is very much under strain right now. Surges in rural areas are especially concerning since many rural hospitals have less capacity to expand and fewer resources to fall back on, which is a trend that predates the pandemic with rural hospitals. During previous surges, we heard about doctors coming out of retirement, caregivers traveling to hotspots, and nursing and medical school students stepping up to help. Those efforts are harder now, given how widespread the current surges are. Part of our focus has been to keep patients out of the hospital so that beds are available to those who truly need them, both for COVID patients and non-COVID patients. And we can say that, you know, the increase in adoption and flexibility around telehealth is an example that helped achieve that. It's helped free up caregivers and has also helped keep people who can receive care and consultations at home out of the hospital. So that flexibility has been incredibly helpful. In addition to what the AHA is advocating for in terms of federal support, which I'll talk a little bit about, we've also been strongly focused on public health awareness and infrastructure. So continuing to encourage people to wear masks and socially distance, as well as making sure that hospitals have enough of the many new therapeutics that are becoming available. Another area of continued focus is personal protective equipment and other supplies. While hospitals and health systems are better positioned with on-hand inventory levels right now than they were at the beginning of the pandemic, serious concerns continue regarding availability, particularly around gloves, isolation gowns, N95 masks and testing supplies. Another area of focus is the eventual equitable distribution of a vaccine. We're already strongly encouraging federal, state, and local government agencies, along with doctors, nurses, and hospitals, to deploy resources now to engage communities, to build trust, create partnerships, and develop communication channels that are going to be needed to ensure that that vaccination effort is successful when it starts. We're also continuing to advocate for healthcare workers to be a high priority population for receiving a vaccine. So given all that, hospitals have faced truly unprecedented financial pressures during the pandemic. Even before all this, the financial health of many hospitals and health systems was challenged, with a third operating in the red in any given year. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen sort of a trifecta of pressures on hospitals. The astronomical costs of preparing for a surge of patients, treating a growing number of uninsured patients, and then months of essential hospital revenue being erased due to the combination of a forced shutdown and a slowdown of regular operations for non-emergent care. And the fact is that hospital volumes are still low, although they rebounded initially. They've remained below historical levels, and now we're seeing certain hospitals starting to avoid elective surgeries once again, and it's possible that that's going to continue as the current surges continue. We've released some analysis projecting losses for hospitals. We've estimated that hospitals may end up losing in excess of $300 billion in 2020 alone, and a number of hospitals more hospitals than normal will have negative margins this year. Needless to say, those losses can have a serious impact on communities' access to care, and the concern is that they could result in closures, and there's already evidence of that happening. So shifting gears a little bit to post-election, at least in the short term, and I'll echo some of the other themes that have come up here. Our priorities at the AHA are to make sure the government gets funded beyond the current budget running out on December 11th, getting another COVID relief package passed. And from our end, what we'd like to see is loan forgiveness for providers, getting additional support to frontline caregivers, getting additional resources for the Provider Relief Fund that was included in the CARES Act earlier this year, continued flexibility for telehealth and for rural hospitals, and addressing equity in COVID care. Healthcare coverage is also critical for ensuring patients access to care, which supports their own individual health, and as well as prevents the further spread of COVID. The economic stress of the public health emergency has already cost millions of jobs, and we expect to see increased numbers of folks without coverage going forward. That's put a great deal of stress on the social safety net, specifically Medicaid, which is struggling to meet the surge in demand. The Department of Health and Human Services is using funds from the CARES Act to cover the costs of the uninsured. We've had some concerns about the comprehensiveness of that fund, and we'd like to see Congress and the administration take steps to make sure that people don't lose coverage, and that some of those coverage gaps that exist are closed. So specifically, and some of these were already mentioned, we'd like to see providing employers with temporary subsidies to preserve health benefits, covering the cost of coverage through COBRA, expanding use of health savings accounts, opening a special enrollment period for health insurance marketplaces, and increasing eligibility for federal subsidies for the health insurance marketplace. In the long term, we're also focused on strengthening coverage beyond the immediate effects of the pandemic. And specifically, we'd like to build off of the framework that was created in the Affordable Care Act. I would agree that given the political realities from the election, either a GOP-led Senate or a very slim Democratic majority in the Senate, it seems unlikely that a very comprehensive replacement for the Affordable Care Act is practical. We're interested in building on the large gains in the ACA and strengthening them, either through legislation or through executive action. Although there were significant gains in coverage immediately after initial implementation of the ACA, there have been increases in the uninsured in recent years. And in hospitals, that's contributed to increases in uncompensated care. So that is the amount of care provided by hospitals for which they don't receive payment. So, we'd like to see increased investment in outreach enrollment, continued state adoption of the Medicaid expansion, solutions to promote affordability and stability in the health insurance marketplaces, and expanded federal subsidies. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Stephanie.
Thanks. That was a great discussion, or maybe I shouldn't call it a discussion. Those were great segments, everyone. I've been taking notes, so I'm going to ask some follow-up questions, and our attendees have been doing the same, which is awesome. So I think I'll start with one from the audience here. This one is specifically for Tony. So if Medicare limits reimbursements to drug companies, what do you predict will happen as it relates to the research of any new drugs? And then there was another one that was sort of similar about, would a reduction in drug prices lead to a decline in the amount of investment in new drugs? So I'll let you take sort of a hybrid of both of those.
Well, I think my answer is pretty clear, but I would love to hear what Jenny thinks, at least from the industry's standpoint. I think if you reduce the payment, if you reduce the reimbursements, you'll get less investment. But that's, as an economist, that's like saying water is wet. But I don't know what Jennifer thinks, though.
I definitely think that water is wet. And I think that the relationship between revenue and investment and in innovation is pretty clear, right? So the direction of the relationship, like completely clear. You cut prices, you will see some reduced investment. Exactly what the magnitude is and how that ripples through and whether some parts of the market are more effective than others, people can disagree about. But I will say one of the extreme frustrations that I have from where I sit is that the literature on this is not very deep. And it tends to be based on small experiments or small experiences where revenues changed a little bit. Small programs or small increases or decreases in government prices. Nothing we have in the literature gives us much to go on in thinking about the type of just like, let's take an axe to it proposal that we've seen out there now. And so all the elasticities, and I am not an economist, so I'm just sort of generalizing and might get the language wrong, but my understanding is that there's no good reason to extrapolate from what we've seen in the past and what's in the literature to what might actually happen. And I would argue that that this is an important question because unfortunately people are talking about proposals that I think are just very, very dangerous. And when I talk to company people, I had a CEO in a private conversation say, we cut more than 30% of our clinical trials. That's not a small change, right? So there's a big disconnect between what investors and what companies see as the implications and what can be deduced from the literature. And why does that matter? Here's why it matters, because the Congressional Budget Office, which actually controls what happens in Congress, to a large extent, because they put a price tag on what it is Congress wants to do, said that, you can kind of have a free lunch. You can cut the revenue and you don't actually see a really huge reduction in innovation. Well, if you talk to anyone in Wall Street who's putting money and capital into early stage companies, they don't feel that same way. So there's a big disconnect between what Wall Street sees and what what CBO sees. And the only way to make that connection happen, this is I'm being shameless here and imploring you future, economists, like we need the literature to reflect that, because I'm quite confident that this is an experiment we don't actually want to run and just see what happens, because it's pretty clear, given the huge amount of risks that already exists in drug development, that if you reduce the rewards in this market, which is the most profitable market in the world, you will have consequences, not just for the US, but globally. Medicines are not really developed for the European market. They're really developed for the US market. And then the revenue that accrues in the rest of the world is a nice to have. I mean, that's being too simplistic, but I think that the truth is that it's what happens here in this market that fuels the global investment of medicines. And it's just not, this is not an experiment we can really afford to make.
Got a couple more questions for Jennifer, but we're going to give her a break for a minute. We'll move away from pharma for just a second. One of the things that was mentioned in a couple of your presentations was around deal making and what we might see moving forward regarding potential antitrust concerns. And I think this is a particularly important topic to expand on, as we've seen a lot of especially provider groups struggling amid COVID. And so I'm going to kick it over to Erin to start, although everyone should feel welcome to jump in afterward. And what are you sort of expecting in the way of deal making moving forward, whether it's vertical integration or horizontal?
Well, frankly, I'm not quite sure what to expect in the future. I will note that, I think the pandemic has highlighted some of the benefits that can come along with being a part of a healthcare system, where you had systems, particularly in the early hotspot areas in New York, where they were able to move resources around from one hospital to another. And in fact, I think Governor Cuomo at one point noted that at that point the entire state had become a health system. So I think that's highlighted some of the strengths. I mean, we've seen that previously, where rural hospitals or other hospitals serving underserved communities join systems so that they could tap into some of those additional resources and capacity.
If I may just jump in, I guess, to maybe ask Liz to respond to this question from the standpoint of health insurers. I mean, they have to, it's maybe not obvious to everybody, but health insurers, when they have to deal with larger entities, more consolidated markets, that poses a challenge, does it not, Liz, in terms of the ability of an insurer to extract discounts that by and large get passed on to enrollees in the form of lower premiums. So not that I'm trying to pick a fight between the two of you or cause a fight between the two of you, but I'm curious to get your perspective on that, Liz.
Erin and I are not going to get in a fight. Health insurers need hospitals and healthcare providers, and making sure that rates are adequate is critical to the survival of healthcare providers and hospitals. So, we're big grown-up people and can have policy disagreements and not get in a fight. I think the answer is that yes, a consolidation of the healthcare provider community is challenging in terms of its impact on plans' ability to negotiate discounted rates. In some cases, that the consolidation is very beneficial to plans in the sense that you're negotiating with fewer actors, and you can sometimes contract in a more efficient way. And then in other cases, it is, market prohibitive. Look at Sutter. There are issues that make it challenging. So, I think there is consolidation across the healthcare market. And so, there, as you said, Tony, there's been consolidation both between health insurers horizontally and between health insurers and providers vertically. And we have many AHIP, we have 130 member plans, many of whom are owned by health systems. And so, you know, it's a complicated nut to crack, but it's all our job to work towards greater affordability in the healthcare system. You know, I will say that, you know, Erin talked a lot about lessons that have been learned in COVID. And one of the things that we have seen, and I think the provider community has seen similarly, is that particularly at the physician level, those physicians that have been, who have entered into risk contracts and who have subcapitated arrangements or other risk sharing arrangements have been more stable because their income from the plans has been more stable as we've seen variability in utilization. And so one of the things that I'm hoping is that as we enter into this new phase of post-COVID contracting, that we will have an easier time collectively, both the insurers and the hospitals, getting to yes on value-based agreements.
I was going to make everybody raise their hands and put you on the spot for this next one, but I won't do that. I'll just let whoever wants to chime in. But I'm kind of curious, like who among this panel, and I have a feeling who's not, but who would be in favor of establishing some sort of an independent review board to assess the value of drugs that could recommend reasonable prices? I know Tony had mentioned ICER earlier, so it kind of came to mind. This is something that I don't know if we'll see, but we are going to certainly hear about. So I'll leave it at that and let you guys jump in.
Well, I'm happy to jump in there first. You know,
I thought you might be.
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts here. First of all, there's no question that we need to have ways of assessing the value of medicines, right? So, and we need to get better at that. And frankly, we do more rigorous work in this country to assess the value of medicines than we do to assess the value of any other type of medical care. I mean, I would put to you that, like, where is the, so yes, we need to do that assessment, but I don't think we want to empower a government agency to have a central, you know, on-off spigot that says that based on, we've decided based on the average patient that this drug shouldn't be available, which is essentially how it happens in other countries, right? So there's a difference between having an assessment process and then using it to make government coverage determinations in a really blunt way. And I think that's what our industry would be opposed to. At the same time that we're trying to put a lot of money, millions of dollars into research to improve the methods for assessing the value of medicines, because we need to be better at measuring and calibrating the things that patients actually care about. You know, like, it's nice to do cost effectiveness to measure things that economists care about, but it's actually better to be, if you're talking about diabetes medicines, to make sure that you're measuring the number of hypoglycemic breakthroughs and the things that patients who are taking those medicines truly care about. And a lot of the assessment methods that we have now don't do that. ICER doesn't do that. Like, there are ways of doing clinical comparisons between medicines to sort of say, is this adding sufficient benefit compared to the standard of care, that I think we could get better at if we had better comparators and better methods and better data. And that starts with knowing even what you're trying to measure. And there's a lot of work happening there. I think we're making progress, and we'll be in a much different situation in 5 years than we are today. But I would also say, like, why are we only having the conversation about drugs? We just said, like, drugs, I would say maybe 14%. I'd go higher than Anthony, like 14% of spending in the US. But
it seems like Erin might want to chime in here.
Where's the rest of it? Like, you know, a fortune is spent on low value care in other settings.
10 or 14% of the spending, but 90% of the attention. And what about the other, what about the other 85 or 90%? And it's a great point.
I mean, I would just like, how can it be true that an appendicitis procedure is cost effective in Missouri and costs 7 times that in Northern California? Like, so what is that cost effective? Like, where is our national conversation about value for other types of care? Sorry. Like,
Well,
I
you
don't
know, we
wanna-
didn't invite, it was not intentional, but we wanted to have a physician on the panel. We could just, you know, call it a day and blame the docs, I suppose, but I don't want to.
I don't want to blame anyone,
I don't
actually.
wanna blame
I think we need to improve I think the reason we don't apply the types of value assessment that we've applied to medicines to other types of care is we don't have the good methods. We haven't figured out some of the technical issues there, but we need help doing that. We can't afford to continue to spend the same level of that we're spending on healthcare. We do actually need to make some progress. And the way to get to consensus is to reduce care that isn't high value and to generate more competition. And also I'd say to drive out administrative costs, which, by the way, like, you know, you're only getting 68 cents of care for every dollar you spend on healthcare in this country. Like, we can do a lot better than that. So like, those are the spaces where we need to have bipartisan work.
Aaron, did you want to chime in on hospital prices?
Well, I mean, I think if you actually look at the aggregate data, hospital prices haven't been increasing drastically over the last several years. They've actually been modest, and I would argue, to Jennifer's point, I think that when you look at the national spending data, it sort of undercounts drug spending. That the national health expenditure data is retail drug spending. Hospitals and providers spend a lot on drugs that they administer, within their facilities as well, and have to, manage those costs and incorporate those into the cost of doing business. So, a lot of those input costs are beyond the control of hospitals. So, well,
can I interrupt and be like, at the risk
Sure.
of making it a little spicy here? Hospitals generally make money on drugs and not the other way around, right? So like, in the commercial market, you buy a drug for $1,000, you generally sell it to commercial insurers at $2,500. So it's not actually a cost center, it's a profit center for most hospitals. But I actually agree with you that hospital prices aren't the problem, right? I wasn't trying to make a case that hospital prices are the problem. My point is that, like, in aggregate, but I do think that there are problems in many parts of the country and that there's inadequate competition, right? So I could think, it's about getting the funding to the places we need it. Like, how can we be spending so much money and still have high need hospitals in poor neighborhoods that can't make it, and have rural hospitals that can't make it? But we have other hospitals that are building, fancy wings that with beds that we may not need. And I think, part of that is because we don't have a competition allocating the resources the way that you might want, because the market is a little bit broken.
I'm
So
gonna
if
jump
I
back
could
over.
jump in, Stephanie.
Oh, please go ahead. I've got another question for you as soon as you're through.
Sure. So just one, we think we should have high value care across the healthcare system. So in Jenny's remarks, she talked about efforts to, cap the copay in certain conditions, and specifically diabetes and oncology. And, I do agree that the effect of that is to lower the out-of-pocket costs for the people who need those services. And the downstream effect of that is to raise premiums for everybody else. And so the challenge is not to do it, but how to do it, right? And so, it is challenging to figure out how to move the system to a system that pays either exclusively or certainly more for those services that are high value, when you have other inputs into the system, like Medicare paying for all drugs that come to market, and limits on our ability to manage formularies in protected classes in Part D. The other thing that just because I know we're throwing a lot of numbers around is every year AHIP does a healthcare dollar, and that is based on 2 years of data in the individual and group market, fully insured, not the TPA market that Tony spoke to. And we're about to release the next one. And I just wanted to share that of your healthcare dollar, 21.5 cents in the individual and commercial market goes to prescription drugs, and 19 cents goes to inpatient hospital costs. So Those data are about to be released. It's only one market. It's only the commercial market, but those are the most current data I have. That's 2016 to 2018.
Yeah, I mean, but can I say, Elizabeth, like that is, it's a very carefully framed and spun analysis. I mean, it seems to ignore the fact that like 18 or 19% of the spending in your analysis is administrative costs and 3% is healthcare profits, health plan profits. So that's 21% too, but it doesn't show it that way. It just, 3% is profits and the administrative stuff is off to the side, right? And hospital inpatient is that number, but there's also hospital outpatient. And I don't really know why you would separate them. So, I mean, it's like, it's designed to make it look as though drugs are the biggest share and the biggest share of the growth. But I think you would know if you look, I mean, and I'm sure in talking to your members that drug spending is not actually driving, it's certainly not the largest driver of growth on healthcare spending in this country. In fact, other types of costs have been growing much faster, administrative costs, hospital costs, it's just like, it's not, there's not enough money there to solve our whole healthcare problem. So it's not that we shouldn't make some changes to the drug market, because we should, and we're game for that. But I think that we need to stop the sort of fiction that that's the first and only place to go, because we will never get out of the spin that we're in, and we will still have the entire public clamoring for an end to a private health insurance system if we don't make that system work better for patients. We can do better.
There, if that's okay, Jennifer. Because I do want to make sure we get to a couple audience questions. We're getting some really good ones coming in. And so I'm gonna ask this one. I'm gonna pose this to Liz. Although again, please jump in where you see fit. So the push for transparency that we've seen under the current administration, what's the general thought process on that? Is that likely to continue, do we think, moving forward? I'll leave it at that.
So there's a bunch of questions in there, because there's been a bunch of different transparency efforts. But let me try to give you a more general answer, and then if you want to get into the more deeply specific, we can certainly do that. So I would, and this is sort of abject guessing, I would not imagine that the Biden administration would seek to repeal the rules that have recently been made final. However, I would say that for health plans, and I believe Aaron and the hospitals feel similarly, we are all in favor of consumers having tools that give them transparency about the cost of the care delivered in their product that is available to them in their market, that's personalized to them, because it is an incredibly complicated system. And knowing that if I'm carrying around one carrier's card, that, here's a charge master of billed charges, it is meaningless to me as a consumer. And so while we support the provisions that relate to cost calculators, and most of our member plans provide cost calculators today, and a limited number of shoppable services, we oppose the requirement that machine readable files be made available essentially to the universe for the purposes of research and app developers and who knows what else. And we think that exactly the affordability problems that we were just talking about will be made worse. This is sort of a fairly simple economics question, which is, does the floor become the ceiling or the ceiling the floor? And we believe that the ceiling becomes the floor when all of the negotiated prices are made public.
So I'm going to jump in here, but I do want to hear Aaron's response to this, because the price transparency issue that Stephanie alluded to and our questioner, I guess, had brought up, I think is, it's really interesting. And I think it has the potential to be a game changer, to get enrollees slash patients slash consumers information that will help guide them. And at the same time, and this is where I'm going to put on my researcher hat, it will provide valuable information that will help researchers understand just where these final contract rates come from. And I think, both the AHA and I believe AHIP are suing to prevent the price transparency regs from being implemented. They maybe each have their own reasons. We've heard Liz's perspective. I'm anxious to hear Aaron's. But
Tony, if I could just correct you, we are
Okay.
not
Okay.
suing. We are continuing to analyze what we plan to do.
Maybe it's just the AHA.
It's us, yeah.
That's okay. Thank you, Aaron, for the clarification. But
Yeah.
so, and I guess, okay, I'm going to shut up. And Aaron, why are you suing to prevent researchers like me from getting this treasure trove of machine readable data that would help us understand the negotiation process and maybe what's working and what's not working?
Well, so I'd echo, what Liz said on this front. I think, cost calculators that allow consumers to actually, be able to calculate their own out-of-pocket expenses are valuable. And, as she said, a number of her members are doing that already. A number of our members are already doing that. I think the data dump of machine readable files isn't going to accomplish that at all. First of all, it's not going to.
I'm going to jump in. I'm just going to say, I think it could do more because I happen to know a little bit about the price transparency insurer tools. I've studied them a bit, and they are slick. They are very nice, and nobody uses them. So whatever the insurers are doing, they're making slick products that nobody's using. I think we need to do a.
Well, consumers are certainly not going to use machine readable files.
Well, no, they're not. But
We could be given much broader ability to create incentives tied to the use of those tools that would drive consumer use than we have today.
I would just jump in here and say that it's hard for me to believe that we are actually debating whether consumers benefit from having more data available about cost and price. It is true that so far the tools that have been out there have not been used. And it's also true that consumers themselves won't use machine readable files. But in this day and age, the machine readable files are really going to be used by app developers who are going to put together something slick for phones. And patients will ultimately get the benefit of that data being out there.
I mean, good.
Well, I think there's some question as to
right?
how the quality of the data that's going to be the guidance that's been issued by CMS is incredibly unclear. There's a serious lack of clarity around what hospitals are actually required to release. So again, this is going to be a bunch of noise that gets dumped out in January at the worst possible time in the middle of a pandemic. That's not going to have an immediate positive impact on consumers.
I think the dump is supposed to happen in is it the following year where the data comes out, or is it's not January this coming, is it? I think it's later, but maybe I'm wrong. Well,
I'm gonna ask another audience question right now. I'm actually just gonna read it directly because I want to make sure I don't change the meaning of what she's looking to ask.
Tony, it's January of 2020.
I'm so sorry, Stephanie. The insurer rule is over a period of years later than that. I think that's where the confusion is. There's a lot of rules.
thank you. Both of you.
Got it. All right. I'm going to read this question now. Should consumers anticipate that the building on the ACA will result in continued consolidation of regional networks? Or could ACA plans offer more of a national network option? I'll leave that one for whoever wants to pick that up.
National networks in the sense of in a national insurance, a cross-state insurance product, or national networks in terms of provider organizations?
I read it as insurance, but I actually don't know. I could ask the person who submitted that question to quickly send me an update. And in the meantime, I could ask a different question.
Sure, I can respond to
Let's assume an insurance for now.
product part, or try to. So Tony discussed at the beginning of the presentation about the multiple layers of regulation of insurance products in the United States. So, to the extent that we're talking about the individual ACA market and expanding the individual ACA market, as opposed to the other things in the Affordable Care Act that affected other markets, those individual market products are regulated at the state level with oversight from CCIO at the federal level. And so there are, under the current administration, there has been an expansion of what's called association health plans, which are available across states. They're available through organized entities that exist across states. But generally, a health insurance product is filed in a state or a sub-region of a state. So I don't know that building on the ACA, as far as I am aware, is intended to move towards regionalization or national plans, or any sort of a geographic expansion or a change in the regulatory structure.
Thanks, Liz. I actually did get clarification. So I'm actually wondering if we could talk a little bit about the provider side as well. And the example here is just, if you're traveling, would you be able to get emergency care elsewhere? And maybe we could use this question to segue into a discussion about surprise medical bills, because I feel like that also could be a fairly timely topic if we're thinking about what's to come.
So I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite understand.
I was going to say, I'm going to pick on someone. Aaron, let's start with you. So is there any thought that maybe building on the ACA, we could see more of a national provider market? And then I sort of added on to this question, which we can tackle later if these two things should be kept separate. But I'm curious, I think about this in the context of surprise medical bills. If you're traveling and you need to get care somewhere, not emergency care. This was a new clarification I just received, not emergency care. If you're traveling and you need to get care somewhere. So is there any sense that we could see a more national provider market as a result of building on the ACA?
I'm not, I haven't heard I haven't heard a national network come up in that particular context around the Affordable Care Act.
Should we transition into surprise medical bills? I'm going to start with Tony. You're smiling, so I feel like you've got something to say on this.
No. I mean, I'm just trying to think of a joke about surprises, but no. I mean, the surprise medical bill. I think there are both. It's well, more than two, I guess. We've got physicians, the hospitals where they are attending, and then insurer policies, and this is sort of it sort of comes to a head here between those three parties not quite being able to get together on the same page. There, and some patients, unknowingly wind up going to see or being treated by a physician that's not in their network, and then they get a quote unquote surprise bill. There are bad ways in my view, there are bad ways to fix this problem, and then I think that there could be some. I guess I would lean towards more market-oriented solutions personally, but rather than kind of heavy-handed, the government putting their thumb on the scale, either in favor of providers, in favor of hospitals, or in favor of insurers. It seems like those three entities could work it out, but I don't know. Two of them are here. We could just blame the doctors.
Sure. So first, I think it's important to remember that the AHA. I think everybody involved agrees that patients should be protected from surprise bills. They shouldn't be balance billed for emergency services or out of network services. It's really just a question of how you resolve those disputes. The AHA is opposed to rate setting or benchmark proposals. We think those are largely arbitrary, and they sort of don't take into account a number of the considerations that do go into rate negotiations between providers and payers.
Erin, do you want to go first? So we absolutely agree on the subject of protecting patients. We disagree on what the solution should be. We believe in a market-based benchmark. We are, based on our experience in multiple states with surprise billing legislation, concerned with data behind it, that when you move people to arbitration, the prices go up. Recent information coming out of Texas, that I'm just gonna pull it up so I can share it. 85% of the arbitration requests in the first 6 months of the Texas law's implementation were from 3 ED doctor groups, Team Health, SCP Health, and Tyven Billing. 85% of the requests were from emergency physicians. The average arbitration award was $660, whereas the most expensive level 5 average in-network rate was less than $500, and the cost of arbitration was $1,000 a pop.
Our arbitration seems designed to make arbitrators more money, I think, and in my view, that seems like not a good way to go. But at some point, at least, I think somebody has to step up and say, well, it could be the hospital to say, look, we're not going to allow you admitting privileges if you do this, but I don't know.
I'm going to jump in because we're cutting it close on time here. And I'm really curious to ask Tony, is there anything, as you've listened to these other presentations, is there anything that as an economist is sticking out to you, anything that you want to ask your fellow panelists?
Well, I've tried to stir the pot here and create some friction to the extent I can. I guess I am definitely certainly of the mind that you folks have the subject matter expertise. You're in the thick of this. You do this every day, and I'm always impressed by just how much institutional knowledge you all have about your field. I think so. I think we've covered a lot of great issues here today. We've got about 4 minutes left or so. I would say, I guess I'd throw it back to Stephanie and say, what does the question pool look like?
Well, I thought it might be fun to end on sort of a round robin and give everyone a minute or so to answer. Obviously, there's a lot up in the air right now, and there's a lot happening in the next few months. But I say this understanding that we're still very much in the midst of a pandemic too. But I'm curious what each of you are sort of hoping to see once there is time and energy to tackle non-COVID related, health policy items. Like, what would be sort of on your wish list for the Biden administration to tackle?
I'm happy. I feel like I've monopolized time earlier, but I think that I'd like to see, I'd like to see incremental progress in shoring up the coverage system we have, so that patients are better able to afford coverage. The pandemic has, I think, shown some of the the challenges we have, and I'm worried about the number of people who are losing jobs and thus insurance, and worried about patients' facing really large financial struggles to, if they do have insurance, to cover their bills. So I think there's a lot that can be done to make sure that people who have limited means can have the kind of generous coverage they need. That's what that has to do with, like, low income subsidies. You can think about it across different markets. I think need to be stronger. We need to think about making benefits work better. And I'd like to see a range. I think there's bipartisan support for a lot of that. And then I think we'd like in particular to see some progress in addressing problems in the pharmaceutical market, like the fact that rebates don't go to patients. So maybe the rule that is going to come out from the Trump administration will help get us there. But even if that rule doesn't get us there, that's a problem that needs to be addressed. Because I would just say, Elizabeth said something earlier about making insurance work and the fact that new types of care had cost to the system. But I think I'm really troubled by the trend currently to worry only about premiums and then to take the cost sharing and pile it onto the sickest patients and say we have to do that to keep premiums down. But that again is turning insurance on its head, right? We want to pool the costs so that sick patients can afford their care. And the goal is not just to reduce premiums for healthy people. And I'd love to see reforms of many different types that help get us back to a functioning system of insurance that spreads costs fairly and also protects sick patients and protects patients with limited means.
Anyone have anything to add?
No, I would jump in and just say that, the one thing early on that we saw when the pandemic struck was that all of a sudden, all of the important occupational licensing, all of the restrictions, all of the licensing requirements, extensive licensing requirements around providers in occupations and physicians, and it all went out the window. And we got sort of a brief glimpse at what a somewhat less regulated world might look like. So, I mean, I hope that, going forward, we don't lose sight of that, about how many really arbitrary and artificial barriers have been created, are generally established, with the aim of keeping out new entrants, frankly, and keeping prices high. And so I hope that one of the takeaways when the dust settles on all this, and it will settle, we'll all get our vaccines. It'll work, and we'll all be better. It would be to take a hard look at a lot of those types of regulations.
So, the one thing, Stephanie, I don't disagree with Jenny at all that I would like to see a more affordable, patient-centered healthcare system, and our plans try to do that, try to build on that every day. But the one thing I think would be real meaningful movement on health equity.
And I would echo that. I would just add, and I think Liz touched on this earlier as well, is additional movement towards value. I think the experience that a number of providers have had during the pandemic around value-based arrangements has been, very interesting and instructive. And I think that there will be, renewed commitment going forward.
I want to take just a quick second to apologize to all the attendees who did not get their questions answered. I bet that if you ask Tony very, very nicely, though, he will respond to each and every one of you individually. And I want to note too, I've been taking notes. This is a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to using this in story ideas in the future. So shameless plug, but keep an eye on cranes. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Tony. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm not sure if you meant the other Tony, but I'm going to just pick it up, and I'm going to thank all of our panelists. I'm going to thank all of our attendees, and this has been really great. Watch this space in the future. We'll be doing more events in the future, and have a great evening. Thanks again to all.